Good evening. Are we on? Good evening and welcome. I'm Mary Beth Graybill. I'm the curator of Asian art, and I'm here to welcome you all on behalf of the Asian Art Council, which is sponsoring tonight's event. And also, we have a number of other sponsors who are involved, and you'll hear about them in a moment. Normally, I like to say that the Asian Art Council's area of responsibility goes from Constantinople or Istanbul to Tokyo, but we're bending southward. We're bending southward tonight to incorporate Egypt. But really, all of the credit for this goes to the person I'm going to introduce in a moment, who has taken the responsibility in an area where there has been abysmal curatorial neglect for a long time, and that's Maggie Hansen. She is the head of our library and collections information, and in the time that she has been at the museum, she has transformed what I know I should never speak negatively, but was an abysmal system in our database where we couldn't find information, and really brought such extraordinary professionalism and changed the working lives of every curator and educator who wants to find out what's in our collection. And the Egyptian scarabs were a big mystery. I came across them when I was trying to produce, as I'm often asked to do, a statistical analysis of the Asian collections, and I do take charge for Islamic materials across northern Africa. So I put in Egypt, and over 1,300 pieces came up. I was just stunned. I thought, what? And so, but of course I had no idea how we could go ahead, but Maggie was already forging ahead, and I want to, on behalf of really the entire museum, thank her for taking charge of that project. So now I would like Maggie to come up and introduce our speaker and the rest of the evening. Thank you, Maggie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. We're so thrilled to see everyone here. Thanks for the introduction, Mary Beth. I appreciate it, and I'm so happy to be here doing work to share our amazing collection with everyone. When I started at the museum 8 years ago, I heard through the registrars about all of the wonderful work that John Sarr, who I'll introduce more, had already done with our scarabs dating back to the early 90s. And I reached out to him probably 5 or 6 years ago to talk about doing a project to get the scarabs online to make them accessible. They're rarely on view, so if they're not online, in a sense, they don't really exist for those of us who want more information. So we talked about it, and as tends to happen, we both got overwhelmed with other projects at the time and sort of shelved it. So I was thrilled when he reached out to me, I guess about 1.5 years ago, to tell me that he was retiring from Intel, and that there was a program through Intel and Social Venture Partners that would basically fund his time to come and act as a fellow with us for a year and accomplish this project. So obviously, I talked about it with Mary Beth, we talked about it with our director of collections, and all sort of jumped at the opportunity to get this important work done. I wrote things down so I won't forget. Let's see. Oh, but really, we just couldn't be luckier than to have John in our community and here working with us on this collection. He has such deep knowledge in the area, but specifically of our unique, important collection at the museum, which incidentally is one of our oldest, and I know John will talk to us about how that came to be. John is an independent scholar, writer, and teacher, specializing in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language and funerary arts. He is also the founding president of the Oregon chapter of the American Research Center in Egypt. So over the last year through this Encore Fellowship project, John has worked over 1,000 hours at this point, really tirelessly, to examine, measure, describe, and transcribe information about every single object in our scarab collection, which I think right now, the exact number is 1,365. It's enormous, and they're this big. So he and I have worked closely together to determine appropriate data and cataloging standards to make sure that when you go online and you search for information, you'll actually find it. Same for our staff. So this is a good time to mention that you can do that now. If you visit the museum's website and go to the collections section and search online collections, you can now see all 1,365 objects in our ancient Egypt collection. Thank you, John. And we'll make sure that there's a link up to that as well. John also worked with several members in our larger collections management team. So I want to acknowledge those people. Thanks to Heather Boucher, who supervised all of our object handling, our conservator, Samantha Springer, who addressed conservation and materials questions, our collections and exhibitions photographer, Ben Court, who has developed a plan to rephotograph the whole collection. You'll notice when you go online that the quality of photography really varies. He's piloted this new project with about 100 scarabs. I think you'll see a sneak preview tonight. They're beautiful, and we do plan on finishing this work. So if you're interested, keep checking back. We'll get there. Also, our librarian archivist, Jessica McIntyre, has worked with John in our institutional archives and library to research the collection and its history at the museum. I'm also really grateful to all of our registrars, Amanda Kahn, Annie Crouchley, and Ann Eichelberg, who opened their workspace and expertise to John. Finally, I want also to thank Mary Beth for sort of shepherding this project through the process. And I want to reiterate deep gratitude to Intel and social venture partners who worked with us to make this project possible, and also for the work that they do in the broader community. If you go to our website, there's a blog post about this project with a few links to learn more about how social venture partners matchmakes retired professionals with nonprofit organizations to help with strategic management, areas where you're lacking expertise to really move projects forward. And so this was a perfect match made for us, and we're so grateful. And thank you to the Asian Art Council for sponsoring tonight's event. I'm stunned and really happily overwhelmed at the response. One last thank you to John Richardson, who's sitting in the back. John has worked hard to set up, not only is he documenting tonight's lecture for our institutional archives, he's also running a Facebook live stream with live closed captioning, really beautiful image and sound. So we know that there are people around the world who are joining us tonight. It's a much bigger audience than just in this room. And we'll be able to take questions from you at the end of the lecture, as well as from our online audience. Who knows how big that'll be. It's very exciting for us. And without further ado, I want to thank John Sarr for your passion and dedication to the museum and to this collection. We really are just so grateful for your time and knowledge and generosity. And I look forward to continuing our partnership. There's more to come. So please help me welcome John Sarr.
Wow. When Mary Beth first proposed this, I thought, oh, the Asian Art Council, sure. There'll probably about 15 people. We'll sit around the table. I'll tell you about the collection and my work. Well, look at this, okay? Not only this huge audience, but the world is watching, so I have to watch what I say tonight. Okay, so I think I have all the tools here that I need. I think we've already, Maggie quickly went over the people that I personally worked with very closely, the social venture partners, museum registrars that she went through. Special note to Ann Eichelberg. She was the person I worked with 20 years ago when I started work on this collection, and she's still there, okay? So it's good to see her. And of course, Maggie, and needless to say, Mary Beth for overseeing all this work. Okay, so the Geyer-Anderson collection of ancient Egyptian seals and scarabs in the Portland Art Museum is a significant collection of over 1,350. I think Maggie just mentioned the count has gone up. We actually found some floating scarabs in the back of the drawer. Okay, so we added those to the list. They represent almost all periods of Egyptian history, all types of seals and scarab amulets, and cover over 2,000 years of history. So as Maggie was saying, as a result of the work I carried out last year, we're now ready to make access to the collection, not just to the 100 and 200 items that were on display. By the way, how many people here remember seeing the Scarab Collection when it was on display in the museum? Okay, yeah, I know you all. Okay, good. Because there aren't many people that I know of or came across who remember seeing the collection, but I'm going to show you, talk about that in a little bit. So tonight I'm going to tell you the story of the collection, how it came into being, where it traveled to, how it wound up in Portland, and what it contains and what the elements of what the items mean in an ancient Egyptian sense. Okay, so to start with, we start with the English collector, R.G. Gayer Anderson. Robert Granville, sometimes known as John, or John to his friends, Gayer Anderson, who was a British Army major, a surgeon, a collector, and an Egyptologist. In addition to the Scarab Collection, Gayer Anderson's legacy includes collections in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, where the majority of his Egyptian objects and papers remain. Also, the Mendelhavs Museet in Stockholm, very large collection, thanks to Gayer Anderson. By the way, many of these collections are online, so if you Google Gayer Anderson and the museum, at the museum, you'll see all the objects that he brought into those museums. He's also contributed to the British Museum, the Gayer Anderson cat, okay, which was a great thing that he found and restored, and of course the Museum of the University College in London. So here we have an early and a later view of Gayer Anderson, but it was an interest in the Middle East, particularly Egypt, the desire to collect, and a discerning eye that combined to provide Gayer Anderson with the ability to assemble quality ancient Egyptian collections, eventually making him an authority on antiquities being sought in his time by European collectors and museums. Now, Gayer Anderson was born July 29th, 1881, in Listowel, Ireland, County Kerry, the older of identical twins. And I unfortunately can't get into all the episodes of his relationship with his twin, but interesting reading. He had an early connection with America, actually, which is sort of a lot of coincidences with Gayer Anderson. Because at the age of 3, he and his family moved to the U.S. They stayed in Tennessee and California and Illinois. And as his pioneering parents tried to turn a profit from the big land boom of the 1880s, that's why they came. So, and it was during this stay that also a passion for collecting first began for Gayer Anderson, wherein he began collecting lead bullets and arrowheads. So, but unfortunately, the business venture of his father was not successful, so the family returned to England in 1891 after 7 years' stay in the U.S. So there's this originally connection with Gayer Anderson in the U.S. Gayer Anderson, of course, was homeschooled in most of his younger life and began attending a private boys' school in Tonbridge in England at age of 13. In 1898, he enrolled in Guy's Hospital Medical School in London and qualified as a surgeon in 1903. Gayer Anderson joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, I think that's his uniform, as a lieutenant in 1906 and was stationed in Gibraltar. In an effort to rise in the ranks, he applied for and was accepted in the much sought-after Egyptian service and was transferred to the Egyptian Army as a major. And he maintains the title of major his whole life. In 1911, he was appointed Assistant Adjutant General of Recruiting for Upper Egypt and was headquartered in Cairo, and with travel twice a year, mostly to the towns of Upper Egypt. It was this travel south of Cairo that opened his eyes to ancient Egypt as he encountered antiquities of all kind, many of which were offered for sale, needless to say, by local dealers. This was a perfect arrangement for him, as Geir Andersen dealt mostly in small objects, which is what many of these collectors dealt in, and such as jewelry, scarabs, statuettes, ostraca. He eventually built up impressive collections that he would exhibit and list for sale in Cairo and later in Europe. It was during this period, yeah, don't you like that? Okay. These are both paintings from his museum in Cairo, okay? But you can't deny the connection there, okay? Pharaoh Geir Andersen, the first. Where was I? So it was in this period from 1907 to 1917 that Geir Andersen assembled the seals, scarabs, and amulets that form the core of the Portland Art Museum's collection. So with the outbreak of World War I, Geir Andersen was posted to British intelligence in Egypt, served a short time in a field ambulance in Gallipoli, and if you know the story of Gallipoli, that must have been quite a deal, and later became a political officer on the Red Sea. In 1917, is the date? Yeah, 1917, he returned to England and brought back with him the future Portland Scarab Collection, along with a quantity of other Egyptian antiquities, and loaned them to the Ashmolean Museum, okay? And here we see one of the objects in the collection, a gold repoussé scarab from the Ptolemaic period, but there's a little label still on this piece that they put on it in probably 1917 when they received it from the Ashmolean Museum, indicating that it's a loan object. But he probably, he sent it to the Ashmolean Museum for display, but also for safekeeping. Remember, World War I is going on. And so where do you put your stuff, your valuable stuff, to make sure it's okay? And of course, museums in Europe during the wars had all sorts of safekeeping for their objects. And so Geir Andersen took advantage of what the museum had by saying, here, you can display my scarabs, but take care of them, and other objects. So after the war, Geir Andersen returned to Cairo, but in 1920, he decided to retire from both the British and Egyptian army and took up a civilian post as a senior inspector in the Ministry of the Interior of Lower Egypt, a position that would return him to a more tranquil life and further facilitate his collecting. In 1924, Geir Andersen retired completely from official service to spend all his time to pursue his love, which was collecting. And here's a watercolor, I think, by his brother, Theo, his twin brother, Theo, of Geir Andersen in his office, and with all the collecting. I like it because there's a real cat looking at an Egyptian cat, okay? This is a copy of the bust of Nefertiti, one of the earliest ones that were made after the discovery of the bust. So, next slide. Yes. So it was in 1925 that Geir Andersen turned his attention back to his antiquities. So in 1924, he contributed regular columns on art, archaeology, and local custom to two journals, the Sphinx and the Egyptian Gazette. And the subjects range from this article, which was sent to me by Salima Ikram. Thank you, Salima. How to Choose a Scarab, okay? Two-part series. And other articles such as How to Care for Your Oriental Carpet. By the way, I read the article, and he basically says, go to an antiquities dealer. Okay. Otherwise, you're going to be had. Okay? Yes. And in 1925, Geir Andersen turned his attention back to his antiquities that he had loaned to the Ashmolean Museum. and asked for them to be returned. Okay, things were safe and no problem, but he had decided to put them up for sale. So he eventually, and that was in 25, he eventually found an American buyer for the Scarab Collection by 1927, and in 1927 the sale was complete. But before we leave Geir Andersen, the one thing I want to point out is that the legacy for which Geir Andersen is best known is this, the Geir Andersen Museum, which is a medieval Islamic building in Cairo. It sits here, and it sits right next to the Ibn Talun Mosque. This is a mosque that dates to about 1000 AD, one of the oldest in Cairo. And here we see the building up in this corner, okay? It's now a museum, and this is the entrance of it. And it's called the Beit el-Kretliya, the House of the Cretan Woman. And it became his in 1935 when the Egyptian government deeded him the house as part of its effort to have individuals provide their own resources, where have we heard that, to restore and maintain the Mamluk and Ottoman period houses of Cairo. So Geir Andersen lovely restored and decorated, oops, not that one, this one, and here's our interior shots of the building, restored it, found furniture that was appropriate for the building and the time that it was built, and he lived in it from that time until he returned permanently to England in 1942. He actually would spend most of the year in Cairo, and then in the summer he would return to England. So, there we go. Geir Andersen was officially recognized by King Farouk of Egypt for his accomplishments in 1943, and was awarded the title of Pasha. Okay, so he is a Pasha. In 1944, he transferred the House of the Cretan Woman that we just saw to the people of Egypt, and after one last trip to Egypt, he died June 16th, 1945, and was buried in Lavenham, England, which is where his family house was, near Cambridge. Now, when Geir Andersen sold his collection, okay, the purchase went to Albert Ernest Doyle, the well-known Portland, Oregon architect and Portland Art Museum. At that time, it was known as the Portland Art Association, Board of Trustees member and eventually president. Doyle, who had been traveling in Europe with his family, bought the scarabs for his personal collection in 1927. Now, Doyle, this picture of Doyle, Doyle was born in California in 1877. His family moved to Portland shortly thereafter. His father worked as a building contractor and later became a senior partner in the Doyle and Porter architectural firm, where Doyle did odd jobs as a boy and gained firsthand experience in the profession. By the way, at that time, there were no architectural degrees. You couldn't go to college and get a degree in architecture. It was something you learned as you went along. Eventually, this would change. Doyle attended public schools in Portland and eventually began work as an apprentice in the city's most prominent architectural firm of Wyden and Lewis in 1891 at the age of 14. Okay? So Doyle spent a total of 12 years at the firm and worked his way up to the position of designer. In 1903, Doyle left for New York, where he worked a few years in the office of architect Henry Bacon, and Henry Bacon is known for the designer of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. In 1906, Doyle took the opportunity to travel around Europe, including as far east as Turkey and Palestine. And this experience in New York and Europe fed Doyle's interest in the history of art and architecture and its influence in the 20th century. And this is a drawing by Doyle of the Parthenon in Athens when he was visiting it on his tour of Europe in 1906. At the end of 1906, Doyle returned to Portland, he married, and he started his own architectural firm. Doyle is often called, of course, the designer of the Portland skyline, having produced the majority of the buildings, more or less, in downtown Portland over a 20-year period. Many of the buildings had an old world, quote, style based on Italian Renaissance, Georgian Revival, and neoclassical architecture, and thus expressed Doyle's attention to history and art. So here we have the Wells Fargo building, the Multnomah County Library, the U.S. National Bank building. He also did the Multnomah Falls Lodge. He designed the Benson Bubblers, okay? And then, of course, if you go to Pioneer Courthouse Square, you look to, well, north, and you see the American Bank building and what was originally Meyer and Frank, now Macy's, now, what is it? I don't know. Nothing. The Nines, okay. And he designed both of those buildings. And here is a little plan of downtown Portland, and it shows you all the places where Doyle had designed a building. Also, the Broadway Garage, the Galleria, just all of these buildings, okay? The Terminal Sales Building, Hotel Monaco, okay? He did that. The Mead Building, many of these that many of us who live here in Portland know. And he designed all of these, and this shows you where they are located. Now, in the mid-1920s, Doyle was suffering from a form of nephritis. It's a kidney disease. And he began to worsen, and there was really no treatment or much of any treatment at the time. So Doyle decided that a year of travel with his family in Europe might improve his health. And so from mid-1926 to mid-1927, he revisited the sites that inspired him 20 years earlier and learned new developments taking place in architecture. In the book on Doyle, it describes how they went down to the Willamette and got on a boat, and the boat went from Portland all the way to Liverpool, England. It went through the canal, the Suez Canal. I think it took them 6 weeks, okay? But it's interesting to think, wow, you could just get on a Delta flight and you'd be there in 10 hours. But yeah, 6 weeks, okay. But, and I'll show you the reference to the book on Doyle if you're interested. So it was on this trip that Doyle discovered the sale of the scarabs and arranged the sale of his stock in the Morgan Building. I don't know if you know where the Morgan Building is, but it was one I believe he designed, and he held stock in the Morgan Building. So he asked his people back here in Portland to sell his stock, okay, so that he would have money to purchase the Scarab Collection. He made a number of installments of, we're not sure exactly how much he paid for it, but we do know that he made several installments of 200 pounds, which at the time was about $1,000. So if he made, let's say, 4 payments of $1,000, which would total $4,000, $4,000 in 1927 is the equivalent of $50,000 today. Okay? So this was not a cheap deal. Okay? He must have really wanted these scarabs. Doyle wrote to his daughter in the fall of 1927 about the scarabs. I quote, "You should see the scarabs. They are all beauties. Our office secretary, in his architectural firm, has them all properly placed in the cabinets, and I believe that they are the finest I've ever seen. It's too bad that they did not arrive before you left for school, for you have had such a good time arranging them." Yeah. The final shipment was dated December 21st, 1927, and on January 10th, 1928, just a few weeks later, Doyle dictated a letter to Gayer Anderson to report on the safe arrival of the last shipment and his plans, Doyle's plans for displaying the objects. However, unfortunately, Doyle was allowed very little time to enjoy his purchase, for he died simply 2 weeks later on January 23rd, 1928, at the age of 50. A year after, oops, I'm hitting the wrong button. Oh, and I forgot this one. Doyle also designed Elliott Hall. Doyle and Elliott were good friends, and so Doyle designed many of the buildings on Reed campus. And I always, this is inside the entryway of the building, and I always like this as sort of a summary of Doyle, that he was a lover and creator of beauty. Doyle. Okay, so now let's jump into the collection. The Scarab Collection, yeah. Okay, so the Scarab Collection, okay, this is a plate that I found that obviously was originally attached to the display case of the scarabs. Thanks to inside information, Carl out there, I had someone, I couldn't find a photo. I searched with the librarian here to see if we could find a photo of the display case of the scarabs. So I drew this one, excuse my sort of Egyptian perspective here. But apparently there were two glass cases that had a two-sided display. There was glass on the top and the two sides to view the scarabs. The sides were solid. And so there were two sort of 2-foot-long cases that would have to sit in the middle of the room because you needed to access both sides. And there were two of them, okay? And recently someone said that there were rollers on the bottom so they could be rolled around in the room, I guess for cleaning or whatever. But just this idea of the case of scarabs rolling down the room. Kind of amusing. But if you look at this, you start counting, it's like, well, there couldn't have been more than 100, 200 scarabs that were displayed this way. And this is what the scarab display was from basically 1929 until the early 80s, okay? Until eventually they were removed from view. Yeah. So when I encountered the scarabs, this is what I found, okay? They, of course, had been taken out of the cases. They had been in storage in the vault. And sort of an ingenious, in retrospect, is sort of, yeah, that was probably a good idea. Not very high tech, but probably pretty good, to put them in styrofoam egg cartons, okay? And so there was some order to this. There were basically, if the scarab was big enough, it would fit in one of the compartments. So, we have the top and the bottom. And there were 125 of these cases, okay, that contained all the scarabs that would fit in these. Sometimes if the scarab was small, they'd put two in a compartment, but this is how I found them, okay? So, and this was in the late 90s, okay, or mid-90s. And so I came in and looked at this and went, oh my God, this is great stuff. This is a world-class scarab collection, okay? And I said, well, so where's the documentation, or how are you keeping track of this? And there was one accession number for the entire collection, okay? There was no way of tracking the individual elements. There were photos, but it was hard to match up the photos with all the scarabs. So I said, well, how about this? Let me come in, and I'll do a drawing of all the scarabs so that you have detail of each one, because the drawing, believe me, a line drawing is always takes precedent over a photo. So I sat down and drew all 1,350 scarabs. And so they still have the catalog, and this was the source. And so I kind of gave them different. One page was carton 1. Page 2 is carton 2. And then you went down A, B, C, D, E. So there was some accounting, okay, after I created this catalog for all the objects in the collection. And I'm not an artist, as you can tell from these drawings, but it gives you a good enough view of if you saw this drawing, you could find the scarab, okay? So you would know if it's there or not there. What's the next one? Now, when the Scarab Collection came to Doyle and eventually to the museum, it came with several pieces of important information. One was a catalog written here, description of items that would match up with a plate, a photo plate of the scarabs, okay? So, and I'm going to show you a close-up of this in a moment. So this is plate A, and how many plates were there? A through F, I think, yeah. A through P. And they were arranged in groups of a certain scarab type. Basically, this is a photo of a drawer in a specimen cabinet. And so Geir Anderson pulled out the drawer, took the photo, and sometimes he'd flip the scarabs over, and he'd call it a reverse, okay? Sometimes he wouldn't. So you can see what's on the bottom of the scarab as well as the top. As you'll see, it's important to know what's on the bottom as well as the top. So he has the photos, he has a little descriptive catalog, and he has this document, which is sort of a background on scarabs. It's grossly outdated now. This is 100 years ago, okay? 1917, 2017, 2018. And so this is another thing I did, job that I accomplished last year, is I digitized this entire set of documentation. This document is written on onion skin paper, typed, okay? So to save paging through this, these are now PDFs, and the museum can access them instead of going to the original. So as Maggie indicated earlier, oh, wait a minute, let me show you. I keep hitting the laser button. So this is the first page of the catalog of the Geir Anderson Museum. This is typewritten by Geir Anderson himself. He even did the little stars, okay, bop, bop, bop. And then every once in a while in the catalog, Geir Anderson writes in his own little hand, and this, of course, says collected between the years 1907 and 17 in Egypt, and until recently with most of my ancient Egyptian collection on loan to the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, RGGA, Robert Grenville Geir Anderson. What else? Oh, and this is a close-up of plate A. This is plate A reverse. So this is supposed to show you the underside of all of them. Obviously, he didn't get it all right, okay, because I'm seeing the top of a whole bunch of scarabs, okay? But this kind of shows you, and by the way, that gold scarab you saw earlier is this one, okay? All right. Yeah, it's too bad he didn't, well, there wasn't much color photography back then, as we know. It makes it a little difficult to match up the scarab if you just have one view of it with what's in the collection. So this is what I did all of last year, is in the database, indicating the access. By the way, during the 20 years, the museum decided to give a new number to every single item, okay, using my drawing catalog. And so what I had to do was match up the new accession number, which is that list on the left. By the way, the collection is 29.16, and then whatever number in the collection. So it starts with 1, 2916, 1, and so on. So we're in the 100s here. And then, of course, all the other information, the title of the piece, the date, okay, giving it a period of time, what's it made of, what's its dimensions, the length, the width, and the height or depth. And then a description of the piece. If there is an inscription in hieroglyphs, I would translate it, and that would be in the description. And then the final column was categorization of the design on the bottom, what it is. So these were entered for every single item, and then this moved into the museum's database and is now published. So what is a scarab? Okay, you may have asked yourself, okay, coming here. I know I talked to a couple of people, and it's like, well, what is a scarab, John? So let me tell you. And a scarab is an amulet in the form of a dung beetle, the Scarabaeus sacer. It usually bears an inscription or design on the underside. So here's a typical scarab. See, with scarabs, you got to show all three sides because you need to know what the inscription is on the bottom. You need to know how its legs are carved, okay, because it's an important element. And then how does the back look? How does the head look? Okay, these are all things to be tracked, and which I tracked, okay, for every item. That's a scarab. Its purpose is to protect from harm or to assure good luck. In certain periods of Egyptian history, these amulets were worn as rings or bracelets or necklaces, also function as seals, okay? So you could seal things with these. But only certain times. By the New Kingdom, they stopped using them as seals. The beetle back is replaced by the heads of gods or humans or animal forms or rectangular plaques or cowrie shells. And when it is, this item is called a scaraboid, okay? It's a scarab-like object. So why was the scarab beetle used as a amulet? Well, the scarab beetle had a symbolic association with the solar cycle, and by extension was at the center of the cosmic powers of creation and rebirth. The perfectly round ball of dung that the beetle fashioned and rolled along the ground reminded the Egyptians of the sun that rose from the earth and moved across the sky. And when the ball of dung was carried below ground as a food store for the beetle, the Egyptians continued the solar analogy and likened this to the sun disappearing below the earth at sunset. The beetle also laid its eggs in the, use it as food store. So here we have the beetle carving out a ball from the pile of dung, okay? And here we have him rolling the dung ball. Notice that, unlike the Egyptian representation, he rolls it backwards. Dung beetles always roll the ball backwards. At first I thought, well, why wouldn't you roll it forward? But whether you're rolling it forward or backwards, he can't see where he's going. Okay? But of course, the front legs are stronger, so it makes sense to use them as a pushing element to get the ball going. So what the dung beetle, by the way, you should Google dung beetles, okay? The dung beetle, what it does is it rolls it along, and every once in a while, it'll jump on top of the ball, and what it does is it orients itself during the day to the sun, and at night to stars, to know where it needs to go to roll the ball to its lair. And gets it in the lair, and it buries it, okay? And so sometimes the ball is used for food, but sometimes it's used to lay their eggs, and when it's used to lay their eggs, it has this pear shape to it, and beetles lay one egg, okay? Female dung beetles may produce only 6 eggs in their entire life. So there'll be one little egg beetle, a beetle egg here in this, and that's what this little circle is. And so this one beetle will come out of the ground, and as the eggs hatch, the young seem to spring whole from the ground, just as the morning sun reemerged from the east from its place below the ground. The beetle was thus seen as having power to make life emerge from beneath the earth after some hidden period of transformation. The word in Egyptian for to transform or to come into existence is cheper, and cheper is written with, guess what? The hieroglyph is the beetle, okay? I'll keep doing the laser thing. So the scarab, the dung beetle, is related, connected to the god Khepri, which you see there, who seated god with a beetle head, okay? Here's the incorrect way that beetles push the ball, okay? The Egyptians like this version better than the actual version. And then, of course, what we have is this symbol, which appears a lot in Egyptian tombs. It's the god Ra, the sun Ra, which is what you see during the day. And then you have the rising sun, which is Khepri, the beetle, and the setting sun, which is Atum, okay? And so here we see a representation of the god Khepri, okay? It's written with the beetle. Oh, that's going. Okay. So that's the connection. What's interesting is this collection has 3 sarcophagi for beetles. Okay? And what I wanted to show you this is the note that Geir Anderson wrote, typos included. It's a sarcophagus, not a sarcophagus, okay? In limestone. So first he describes this one, okay? Oblong box, hollowed out, and surmounted by the effigy of a scarab. He gives the measurements. And then there's this one, which is oval-shaped, and this is his favorite word, one ditto Okay? In other words, whatever he just described, repeat it. Okay? I'm not going to retype it, as he's saying. One ditto in I'm going, ditto? What? Okay, one ditto in limestone shaped as a scarab and hollowed out underneath. These all have a hollow surface. These are basically the lids for the sarcophagus. And then, of course, there's this one in faience, a very nice green, and it has the scarab beetle and, of course, its wings down the side. History of scarabs, amulets and burial, Egyptian Neolithic, Badarian period. Here we see a body in a fetal position, some pots, some pots. There's a mistake with the pots, but we won't go there. Some of the pots don't date to the Badarian period, which is about 4000 BC. But when we find these burials, we note that they're also buried with amulets, okay? So the idea of amulets or jewelry, protective things attached to the body goes way back in Egyptian culture. Originally, the cylinder seal was used in Egypt. We know this because the actual word for seal is this hieroglyph. And what this is doing is replicating one of these objects, which is a round circular cylinder seal that, when rolled, will give you, we're not sure, we think their name. These are difficult to read because these, it's kind of going out, and I guess the battery's going down. There we go. And so to the right is actually the hieroglyph for seal, chetem. And so here we see the little guy, and the hieroglyphs read over there, chetem bit, which is the sealing of honey jars, okay? And that's what he's doing. He's actually sealing the jar, okay? And then after cylinder seals, we see them mostly in the Old Kingdom, but after the Old Kingdom, we start to see these button seals. It's a little bit easier to indicate a seal or an impression if you have a little flange on the top and that you can press down. You don't get your fingers dirty, okay? You don't have to put them in the mud or in the clay item that you're impressing. And these items usually have stick figures or linear patterns. Here's a nice little first intermediate period scribe, okay? It's about half an inch, okay? And it has a little maze pattern on the bottom. It's actually two-sided. There's a scribe on each side. Then we finally get to scarab amulets and scarabs, but scarabs don't appear until the Middle Kingdom. There are no scarabs until then, the end of the Old Kingdom, beginning of the Middle Kingdom. And here we see how the seal might work. You can seal a letter, okay? Like here, you fold the letter, you put a little clay on the string, and then you impress the seal on it. Or if you have a door, you tie it up, put a little mud there, and impress the seal, and you know where things have been opened or closed. They still do this in Egypt, by the way. If you have a tomb that's being excavated or that is on the map of excavated tombs, when you officially close the tomb for the season, the inspector of the area will come in, and he has this little device, and he has a wire that they lock it up, lock the tomb up, but then there's this little wire with a little piece of lead at the end, and he has this seal that he seals the tomb, seals the door with the two ends of the wire, so that they know if the tomb is intact or has been disturbed since the last time it was open. So that's interesting. And of course, we know these are seals have personal names, as you can see there with their titles. Scarab typology, things to look for. How is the back design? How is the head design? How's the side design? Is there a design on the bottom, or is there no design on the bottom? Drilled through. Is the object drilled through? By the way, every single item in this collection is drilled through, except heart scarabs. Heart scarabs are never drilled through, and I'll show you heart scarabs. But what this means, of course, is that every single one of these items in the collection were threaded, wired, and attached to an ancient Egyptian at one point in their life. Okay, mostly during their life, but also as a means of protection in the afterlife. And of course, size varies, size matters, but most of the scarabs in the collection or 1 inch or less. So let's look at the scarab form. I wanted to show you a picture of a close-up of the beetle. What's interesting is they do pretty good job at duplicating it. Is the head naturalistic? Does it look like the head? Do you see the head, the eyes, the clypeus, and the plates? This is the prothorax, okay? And these are the elytra. These are actually remember beetles fly. So these are the wing cases. And what happens is, if you look here, okay, these little bumps, these are what these notches are. They're the humeral callosity, or the joint of the wing, and the wing twists out so the wings can come out and the beetle can fly. What's interesting, can you see the hairs on the beetle? Okay, the line, the edges of the beetle, and that's what these lines are on this rendering, is to duplicate the hairs that the beetle has. Okay, so these are all elements, and so scarabs appear either they're going to be lined back with or without V notches. They're going to have naturalistic legs. Naturalistic means I can see all 3 legs. I can see the foreleg, the mid-leg, and the hind leg. And then there's an inscription on the bottom. But in certain periods, at certain times, we have what's called a plain back. There's no lines on it. Okay, there's no distinction of prothorax or elytra. And of course, look here, the legs are just simply, it's just a line, okay? There's no distinction of the legs. So these things need to be noted when you're documenting scarabs. And this is to show you a ruler with 1 inch. Okay, to show you the size of most of the scarabs. This is a little undersized, okay? It's a little under half an inch. But notice it has the line back, the head, the legs are carved, the inscription is there, and this is on an object that's no bigger than this. And they only had copper tools, okay? So it's an amazing, so believe me, if you see a real scarab, you know it's a real scarab, because a modern day scarab, they wouldn't have spent the time to put this detail in on something that small. Most scarabs are made of steatite, and the steatite is glazed. Steatite is very soft. Steatite is soapstone, and that's where we get talcum powder. So it's very soft, it's easily carved, which is why they like to use steatite, but it could crumble and be harmed. So what they would do is they would glaze it, and when they glazed it, they would glaze it green or blue, and it would make it as hard as some of the gemstones that they worked in. It would bring up the hardness on the Mohs scale from 1 or 2 up to 3 or 4. Okay, the Mohs scale of hardness for stone. Yeah. Anyway, then there are items made of faience, okay, few in bronze, and then they like to use semi-precious stones. This is neat. When I got all the information together, I could do analysis of count. How many of these are in the collection? How many of that? And so we see that of the semi-precious stones, serpentine seems to be the most numerous. And what color is serpentine? Green, okay, and this is one reason why it was used a lot. So semi-precious stone, amethyst, feldspar, gold, cornelian, rock crystal, lapis, basalt. Often these would not have an inscription on the underside. Number one, they were harder to carve, okay, because they're much harder to carve than steatite. But also just because of their color, they indicated something. Cornelian indicates blood, which is life and strength. Feldspar there is greenish. Anything green is fertility, life, revival. The lapis is the blue of the sky, and some people say that the word for lapis in Egyptian is similar to the word for joy. So definitely what's going on there. Actually, I'm doing this without following my notes. Then there are animal scaraboids, animals on scarabs. So the many plants and creatures of the land held special significance to the Egyptians. Plants were depicted on scarabs to convey their regenerative aspect. Papyrus, with its green color, symbolized life and renewal. The lotus, which closed at night and reopened in the daylight, symbolized renewal and rebirth. The sedge plant, which is up there, the sedge plant there represents the king of Upper Egypt, and of course the bee is the symbol of the king of Lower Egypt. Creatures such as scorpions, crocodiles, and lions could be harmful. We see scorpions, crocodiles, lions, cobras, okay? Why would you put those in a scarab? Well, you could do that to appeal to these fearful creatures, because once they were inscribed, in some ways you paid homage to them so that they would not harm you. Would carry this amulet around to keep away the lions, crocodiles, and cobras. Okay. And as for the benign creatures of the Nile, of the land, such as the hedgehog, the hare. The hedgehog is one of my favorites. Okay. The hedgehog, the hare, antelope. Okay. A man with crocodiles, sort of taming the crocodiles. Okay. And of course a cat. All right. Of course, if you know me, of course I don't put cat in there. And so these are creatures that lived in and survived the life-threatening desert, and as a result symbolized survival and regeneration. The other thing is the Nile, and these are animals of the Nile. They would be represented. The Nile was the source of all life in Egypt, and so you would have frogs and ducks. I always like the ducks because they're sleeping. Hippos and the tilapia fish, which is what this is, okay. And they like the tilapia fish because I believe the tilapia fish broods its young in its mouth, okay, holds them in its mouth to protect them. And so the Egyptians thought that was a nice image to have, okay. And then cowroids, okay. So if the object is in the shape of a cowrie shell, it was known as a cowroid. And the cowrie shells came from the Red Sea, and they served to protect particularly women, especially pregnant women, and they ensured fertility. Many people say that they look like the female genitalia, and that's why there's this close association with women. I come at it as, well, you know, they kind of look like Waja eyes, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So the protective eye of Horus. So maybe there's a connection with that too. But when we see that, you know, they have Hathor, the protective goddess Hathor, on the bottom of these cowrie shells, and they could be round or they could be long, oval, and sometimes the back is decorated. Most of the cowrie shells are plain. There's no decoration on them, but this just show you some of the examples in the collection. And of course, Wajadai plaques, the old Wajadai, or the Eye of Horus. This supposedly represents the right eye, but I have seen, well, it could be the left eye. I don't think people know if it's the right or the left. But what I found interesting is the examples I pulled are all right eyes. Okay, so maybe it is the right eye. And then I gave you a little picture of a falcon up here to say, oh, well, maybe that's where they get some of this design of the eye and the little marking on this eye. And of course, these come from the Egyptian word wujat, the restored eye, referring to the eye of Horus that was torn out in a battle with Seth, but was restored by the god Thoth. So anytime you have the Wajad eye, it's a symbol for healing, health, and protection. So images with the king. Here we have the scene from the Namar palette. The king is killing the enemy. He has a mace in his hand. He wears the crown of the kingship, and he's bashing in the head of the enemy. That was a favorite theme of Egyptians. Okay, here we have the same thing repeated on the scarabs. He has a mace in his hand, and he has an enemy he's ready to kill. Mace in his hand, and he has the enemy that is ready to kill. Okay, as the king is seated on the throne, and the king can be represented by a lion. We know it's the king because in the hieroglyphs tell us that these are titles of the king. And of course, in the New Kingdom, they introduced the chariot, and so actually it says Thutmose III, but so here he is in the chariot, and he's got the enemy. The horse is trampling the enemy underneath. Okay, so those are the images of the king. Sometimes you have their name, and here we see the name of several of the kings: Amenhotep II, Thutmose III, and Merneptah, Amenhotep III. He's everywhere. Senwosret I from the Middle Kingdom, Ahmose, the founder of the New Kingdom, and then Shushank, which is Shishak from the Bible, same ruler. And then if we do a king's list, okay, so I did my counting again, going to the database. Who's the king most mentioned? And it is, and the winner is Thutmose III, okay? Followed by a close second by Amenhotep III, which is interesting. What I found interesting was Seti I, 22. I like Seti I, okay? I think he beats out his son Ramses II, okay, in more ways than one. But that's for another lecture. But yes, Thutmose III. Actually, Thutmose III's scarabs, we find them from the time of Thutmose III in the New Kingdom up until 1,000 years after his reign. This was a very popular king for some reason, and power of his name. And here is our friend Thutmose III, also known as Menkhepere. Here's his cartouche, Men. Okay, can we get it? Men, Kheper. There's the Kheper sign, the beetle, Ra. So Menkhepere. And we see several versions, ways to write his name in the cartouche. Sometimes the scarab acts as the cartouche, which is this elongated, supposed to be a circle, but it's an elongated circle that indicates the nomen and praenomen of the ruler, of the king. And so can you match up, Menkhepere. Oh, by the way, you notice that the Re sign comes first, but is pronounced last, okay? This is something in Egyptian script called honorific transposition. So anytime you write a god's name, it has to come first. This is why if you see a cartouche of Tutankhamun, the word Amen is the first word in the cartouche because it's the god being mentioned. But it's not read first, it's read last, okay? That's your 30-second class on Egyptian hieroglyphs. Okay. This is the thing that blew me away when I saw this collection for the first time, are these Amenhotep III commemorative scarabs. There are, which are these two, okay, not the prettiest scarabs, okay, sorry, not the prettiest scarabs, but the museum has 1.5, okay, wow, of these. There are only 200, there are about 200 known, documented scarabs of this type in the whole world, and we have 1.5. Basically, there are 5 themes of these commemorative scarabs. The theme that we have, they're both the same. They're the lion hunt scarab, lion hunt commemorative, and basically half the scarab is his name, okay? So down to here, that's his name, okay, all of that. And then his wife, then he lists his wife's name, which is T, okay? And then it says from year 1 through year 10, the king brought down 103 lions. That's all it says, okay? But, to show his prowess, to show some fact in his life. These are very strange. They're not really amuletic, but they are amuletic. Are they calling cards? Are they historical documents? What the heck are these commemorative scarabs? We're not sure. They are drilled through, but these things are like 3-4 inches long. You can't wear this, okay? So where would you stick it? Good question, okay? And then, of course, over here, we have a scarab with his wife, T, great royal wife, T, may she live. And at this time, the queens also were starting to put their names in cartouches, but they only got 1 cartouche. Kings got 2, okay? And here we see the two cartouches of Amenhotep III, his praenomen, which is what this scarab is, and then his given name, which is Amenhotep. Gods, another accounting. What's the god most represented on scarabs? Amen-Ra, okay? He started out as Amen. By the New Kingdom, they add the Ra element to him, okay? The sun element, the creator element, Amen. So they kind of puff him up a little. Then we have, and of course, it makes sense to me, Hathor and Bes, so that you know Hathor, a feline goddess, and Bes, a sort of strange, I'll show you a picture of him, household god. These are the sort of local gods, the gods of your house, who would protect you, protect your children, protect your wife. Ptah, we see the scarab here with Ptah on it. Hathor is often represented as a female with cow ears, often with the sistrum, or the rattle, that she's associated with, the rattle. Isis, okay, Sekhmet. These feline goddesses kind of meld one to the other, but that's okay. The Egyptians had no problem with that. And there's Bes. There's Bes. He's this weird sort of lion-maned dwarf. He has a tail. He's ugly. He has this funny feathered headdress. But he was the god par excellence to protect children, to protect women who were pregnant, and to keep your household intact. Amen. So here's the cartouches with Amen. We see the Amen name up there. And you'll see it repeated in all these cartouches. There's rarely an image of Amen, which is kind of strange. We always have his name. But because, and there are quite a few scarabs that have a cryptographic writing for Amen, because Amen, in Egyptian, Amen means the hidden one. So oftentimes the Egyptians, they loved plays on words and so on. So they would hide the name of the hidden one, okay? And so they would do things like the sun disk on the bird here is Aten, so we're going to take the first sound of Aten, which is A, and then this is the mott feather, so we're going to take the first sound of the mott feather, which is M, and then this is a neb basket underneath, and the first sound of the neb basket is N, so you put them together and you got Amen, okay? So we've hidden the name of the hidden one, and they do this a lot. During the Middle Kingdom, we find all these little designs on scarabs. And notice there are scrolls, there are crosses, there are circles, and knots, okay? And at first it was like, what is this all about? But someone indicated that the words for amulet and protection are these two hieroglyphic signs, both pronounced the same way, sa, and they indicate a cattle hobble, that is ropes that will tie the foot of your cow so it can't run off, okay? It's a means of protecting the cattle, not to hurt them. And then, of course, the other thing is a life preserver. It's a mat reeds tied around, and you would put it over you if you got in the water to keep from going under. I don't know if the Egyptians knew how to swim or did much swimming. I would not want to swim in the Nile with all the crocodiles in it, so I don't know what they did. But anyway, maybe there's a connection between this, the idea of ropes and tying and knotting with the word for protection, and that's why they developed these, but we're not totally sure. This occurs mostly in the Middle Kingdom. And then amuletic hieroglyphs, which is, there are certain hieroglyphs that just have magic in them, okay? And you just pile them up on a scarab, okay? You got the Waja eye for protection. You got the one big one is the Nefer sign. It just means goodness. The Ankh sign meaning life. The Nebu sign meaning gold. Neb sign meaning Lord. Nesubiti meaning the king. And so you'll see these. So you see a lot of Ankhs. You see a lot of Nefers. Oh, they're Ka signs. But you see these scrolls and so on. What I find interesting is that notice how symmetrically these things are arranged. I mean, that's the thing with hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are architectonic, they're artistic, and Egyptians can be more concerned about the placement than the correct form of the word, okay? So we have those. Wish formula, I can't get into all these, but just to show you the color of the scarabs, glazed scarabs. This one says Happy New Year. It's one of my favorites. But notice the balance that they have this hieroglyph, the sun fits inside this one, and then you have these two long hieroglyphs. Yeah, it's going out. That sit parallel to this sort of nice balance of arrangement, okay? And then, of course, over here, you can see where the glaze has worn off. Now, all of these scarabs we've seen so far are ones that people probably used during life. They might have been buried with them. But these scarabs that we're going to look at quickly are scarabs that would only been there in death, placed on the body at death. The heart scarab is the number one. Heart scarabs usually contain this prayer, which is 30b from the Book of the Dead. Okay, it's inscribed on the scarab. Sometimes the heart scarab looked like a heart. or at least the hieroglyph for a heart. And this was important because in the final judgment day, or okay, when let's see this, this is my cat's. That's not working either. Okay, no, never mind. Where we see the heart on the left, there it is, being balanced against the mott feather on the right to indicate whether you lived a true and noble life, okay? You needed the heart scarab. The prayers say it needs to be of a certain stone. This is so it weighs the right amount. There are all these sort of precautions. But in general, the heart scarabs would have been in a chase. This is why they're never drilled through, because the chase would have been the thing that held them to the body. Obviously, looted tombs, robbers would have come in, taken the stone out of the chase, thrown the stone away, and then melted down the gold. Okay? So this is why we find a lot of heart scarabs. There's no inscription on the bottom because they would have been on the gold chase, on the bottom of the gold chase, and they're not drilled through because the chase that they sat in was destroyed. So the collection has quite a few of the heart scarabs. Then we have these naturalistic scarabs that appear in the 25th dynasty. There's no inscription on them, and what you do is there's a little place here underneath with a hole, and you'd sew this onto the mummy wrappings, and you could have 1, 2, 3, but it's a form of a heart scarab. Same thing here with the funerary scarabs, which have wings, okay? And so these you can attach to the mummy, and they're often accompanied by the 4 sons of Horus. Notice the holes. This is where there are holes. Holes here. Holes. There are like 8 holes in the central scarab, and no inscription, and they're sewed on to the mummy wrappings or the net that's on the mummy. And of course, to show you the 4 sons of Horus are these 4 gods that would normally contain the canopic jars that would normally contain your internal organs. By the later period, and these sons of Horus, these final sons of Horus, was something that developed in the late period, and by then hardly anybody was being buried with canopic jars. So that what they do is they mummify the internal organs and just stick them back inside you, so that you are self-contained. You have your own tomb by yourself. And so these, finally, these are things that are discovered through scarabs. Scarabs give the first depiction of the horse in Egypt. And even more so. The horse was introduced by the Hyksos in the 15th, 16th dynasties, and they also introduced the chariots. The Egyptians did not have horses before then, and so it's on the scarab that we find the first instance of horses. And this was a discovery. This is not in the collection, but this is in, I think, the British Museum. But this is the first instance of a person riding a horse in Egypt, okay? We knew that they used horses, but most Egyptologists believe that the horses were only there to pull chariots. They weren't ridden. But here we have something from a scarab collection that shows you that they're actually riding a horse in the beginning of the New Kingdom. The other thing is evidence. I talked about Hyksos. The other thing is evidence of the Hyksos reign. The Hyksos didn't leave many monuments behind, but they left a lot of scarabs. So scarab sometimes is the sole source of knowing that there was a certain Hyksos ruler in Egypt. And they also do sort of weird things like they take the scarab back and they make a human head, okay? There's this style, Hyksos style. Say the hatching is used a lot in filling the items. And then there's this Anra pattern, words, signs that don't really mean anything. Like here's a cartouche, but it just says Anra in it and doesn't mean anything. So is it like they're just pretending like they're hieroglyphs? Okay, I'm gonna draw a hieroglyph. And so this is sort of nonsense. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, cryptographic writing. This is the other thing that you find on scarabs. The name of Amen and this wish formula. And they're playing with the name of Amen. This is one of my favorite cryptograms for Amen because it's an island with the letter or with the sound in. And if you take the first letters of island with the in, you get amen. Okay? So this is actually writing amen. Same thing here. Of course, I got to bring a cat in. The sun disk is I. The word for cat is mu. The word for basket is neb. So it's amen. Okay? And of course, the hiss is praised of amen. And so finally, my closing note here. I guess I could do this without all my notes. Geir Anderson wrote that the detailed documentation on scarabs is necessary to appreciate the objects in the collections as a whole. So I hope that my summary tonight on these scarabs and their evolution, structure, and purpose, and their intimate relationship with the people of ancient Egypt helped you to understand ancient Egypt a little better and added interest and appreciation of this world-class collection. Thank you. And I want to quickly show you the site, if you could pull that up. Yeah, here we go. That if you go to the museum site, the online collections, you will find all these scarabs. And if you will scroll down and open the one that one, and you'll see what's there. There are going to be three views: the view with the inscription, the top view, and the side view. Okay, and there's the top view. Notice lined. Okay, naturalistic legs, a naturalistic head. Okay, and then of course an inscription on the bottom, but we won't worry that one. Yeah, let's click that one. Yeah, inscription on the bottom. You all probably can't read all the hieroglyphs. Okay, but if you look at the close this one and go back to there we go, and scroll down. Scroll down. So you'll see all the information: the size, the period, the links to definitions used, and then of course the description. The top is naturalistic head, line back, blah blah blah. Side, naturalistic leg. Bottom, vertical orientation. It's a wish formula, and it says Amen of Thebes is praised therein. So I've translated in many places some of the inscriptions. And so now this is available to you, to the entire world, okay? And you can access them at your will. We are going to make improvements. Many of the graphics need to be reoriented. Some of the photos need to be retaken. There are some scarabs that need photos. I'm planning to write a number of documents that will be PDFs that will be attached to this. So if you want to see what amuletic scarabs are and what they mean, you'll be able to do that. The typology, explanation, all sorts of other little documents that will attach to this, so that it becomes a total learning experience with this great collection here in the Portland Art Museum. One final. Am I down here? Okay. Yeah. One final thing. It's noted in the notes that I'm the president of the American Research Center in Egypt, the Oregon chapter. If this lecture tonight was interesting to you, you want to know more about ancient Egypt, visit our site, arce.org, and go down to the chapters button, and it'll show you and find Oregon, and it'll tell you some of our activities. We're also on Facebook, RC, just to do RC Oregon Facebook, and we have a site which gives you more information about our upcoming lectures. And if you want more information about any of the topics tonight, there's a brand new book out on Geir Anderson that by Foxcroft. If you want to know more about Doyle, Beauty in the City is a very good book. And if you want to know more about amulets on ancient Egypt, Carol Andrews, a colleague and friend, wrote this great book, and I recommend it. So thank you, and I guess if there are any questions. Oh, and I have a few brochures from RC if you're interested, or you can go on the site. Yeah.
Could you talk to the process of dating?
Process of dating. Some of it is the typology. You have to know, for example, the V-notches. The V-notches only start to appear in the New Kingdom. So you see a V-notch on a scarab, it's New Kingdom or later, mostly New Kingdom. The design, sometimes the design. You don't find Amun-Ra on a Middle Kingdom scarab, for example. You find Amun. So there are all these things. This is why you have to take in all the typological sides of a scarab. How is it carved? What's the inscription? What does the inscription say? And then, of course, comparing it. The problem is that the one thing that a lot of Egyptologists won't get into scarabs is because if you don't know where it comes from, you don't know its origin, then and its archaeological context, it's hard to date. We do have digs where we've come up with scarabs. We know this type of scarab. We know at the date of the dig. And so we can make comparisons that way. But this is one reason why a lot of Egyptologists won't touch scarabs that have no provenance known. Because it's like, well, what? But even if you know the date, what good does it do you? Okay. So, but there are ways of figuring that out. Yeah. Yeah. Why aren't they on display? Yeah, I asked that question too. Well, first, well, maybe we need somebody from the art museum to address that. I'd like to see that. But number one, I've traveled all over the United States and Europe to look at scarabs and museums, and there are countless ways you can display them. But 9 times out of 10, you have a shelf, and you have 50, 60, 300 scarabs laid out on a shelf. Does you no good, okay? Does you no good. I've seen things where you can have scarabs and they're on little wires and then there's a mirror underneath them because you need to see the bottom as well as the top. So it's just difficult to display them, okay? And if you do, what do you show the bottom? Do you show the top? Because obviously you can only show one or the other. And but if they're online, okay, you can. I mean, ideally, a virtual reality scarab where you could turn it, as a hint museum, okay, would be ideal because that way you can manipulate it and see it from all angles. The one thing missing from all these scarabs, even though we have the 3 views, is you can't see the drilling that goes through because you'd need to see the front part, and that's usually not interesting. So, but yeah, no, the scarabs were taken off display. It's a question of popularity. It's a question of money. It's a question of where do you put it? Where does it fit into the curatorial process in the museum? There are a lot of factors. But this is the next best thing, okay, putting these online. Any other questions? No? No? Anything online? No? So that's it? Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
That we get them from his lifetime lasting for 1,000 years. So were any of these royal possessions, or is it just an ordinary person seeking to soak up some celebrity value?
I'm glad you mentioned that. It was one thing I forgot to mention. These scarabs with royal names, they did not belong to the king. They're just simply tapping in to the power of kingship to bring in that strength and protection into your own environment. Okay, so these would not have been the scarabs of the pharaohs themselves.
So there were no rules that you weren't allowed to.
Exactly. And in fact, you won. And the other thing with Thutmose III, guess what? It's also a cryptogram for Amun. Okay, so this may also explain why it was used for so long. Okay. I mean, Thutmose III was a great king, but was he that great? I'm not sure. Okay, why did it last so long? It's hard to say, but it's very simple, 3 simple hieroglyphs. Maybe that was why. I don't know. Yeah, a good question. Yeah.
Can you describe the history of selling things by the Egyptian government or by private parties in the early 1900s, and when it became that the government didn't want people to take stuff out of the country?
There were laws passed the Egyptian government passed laws in 1912 antiquity rules. And it was at that point where if you wanted to take out any antiquity, it wasn't that you couldn't take out antiquities, but if you wanted to take out antiquities, number one, you needed a certificate when leaving the country, and it had to be signed by an antiquities dealer, and it had to have the approval of the government to leave. There were also sorts of rules. Up until then, there was this thing called partage. So if you financed a dig, you could get half of you could take home half the stuff you dug up. But this stopped in the beginning of the 20th century because that's why we have so many Egyptian antiquities in museums in the US and Europe, this was going on. But the law in 1912 started this, okay? And in fact, and there are rules like if a tomb has been looted, then it's not an intact tomb, and so the partage could take place. If it's an intact tomb, the Egyptian government owned all the contents, and none of the contents could leave. This was the argument that Carter got into, because he says, "Oh, Tut's tomb, it was broken into. This is not an intact tomb." Give me a break, okay? It was an intact tomb, okay? Yeah, the robbers did get in and they broke in, but the body was still there. And it was all in place. So, by the way, talking about Tutankhamun, there are two Tutankhamun exhibits coming. There's one that's opening in Los Angeles at the end of this month. Real Tut stuff, okay, is coming in. It's to celebrate the 100th anniversary, 1922, of the opening of the tomb, and it's traveling around the world. It's starting in Los Angeles, then it's going. So if you miss it in Los Angeles, you have to go to Paris, okay, which is the next stop. Yeah, you might want to miss Los Angeles, okay? Just go to Paris. And then it's going to London, it's going to Washington, D.C., it's going to Philadelphia, it's going to a couple places in Japan, but it's some of the actual stuff. No, it's not the coffins, it's not the gold mask, those will never leave the country, okay? So, but we're having one coming here to Portland at OMSI in the fall. I call it the Las Vegas Tut exhibit, because it's a reproduction of every single item they found in the tomb, and it's all laid out. They might even let you touch some of this stuff. I don't know, because it's all fake. But it will give you an idea of the contents, the shape, what it looked like, and so on. But it's supposed to be at OMSI. I think it starts in October. So something to look forward to. Anything else? Yeah. I would have a scarab expert look at them to give you an idea. I might know one. Preferably, you have photos, and you could email photos, okay? And because I've been asked to look at scarabs. I've been told, "Oh, I'm going to give you the scarab. It came out of Tut's tomb." And I go, "Well, maybe not. No." So if you know what you're looking at, you know if it's a real scarab or not. And so that's where you start. Are these real scarabs? Because, okay. But is it valid? Because I've seen some pretty crappy stuff at some antiques dealers. Their name begins with S, so I can't make the name. Not Sotheby's. Okay. Another antiquities dealer. And I just you want to charge $1,000 for this? And it was fake, so you have to be careful. Anything else? Yeah. What's the value of the Portland collection? That's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, if it started out at $50,000, what is it now? I mean, I made a guesstimate of $500,000. I don't know. Mary Beth? Oh, they have a blanket insurance policy. Okay, anything else? No? We're good? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, it's been a pleasure. Okay, thank you all.